Welcome to All the Year Round, a monthly podcast on 19th century British literature and culture that will take you through the seasons. I'm Emma Probert and I'm working on a book about Jane Austen, Elizabeth Gaskell and the novel of manners.
And I'm Dr. Hayley Flip and I'm working on dreams and their portrayal in 19th century literature.
In this month's episode, we're going to be tackling the elusive question of what women want, 19th century edition. So,
what do women want in the 19th century?
So many things. It's varied. As with today, answer, varied. And we're going to go into all of them. But before we go into it, we're first going to be chatting about the day that we're uploading on. So today is February 13th, which is known as the day before Valentine's Day. So this is your warning, friends. If you have not got your loved one flowers, if you have not got them chocolate, this is the warning. Go out. Go now. Stop listening. No, listen to this. But just as you're listening to this, venture forth and grab what you need to grab.
Good advice.
Thank you. But today, for those of you who are left, we are celebrating Galantines Day or Palentine's Day. So, for the uninitiated amongst you, Galantines Day was first created by an American TV show called Parks and Rec, I believe, season 2. So I want to say like a 2010 time, I think. It was this idea that the main character came up with of basically ladies celebrating ladies. So it wasn't just like romantic love. The idea was sort of lifting people up, and the main character, that she has these heartfelt essays that she gives to people and these really thoughtful gifts. I know, and I was like, I love that, and that took by storm. So Galentine's Day is up there, and the reason why I would say Galentine's Day is because basically, again, the internet loved it so much. We're just like, why not all friendships regardless of gender? Why don't we just have a day where we celebrate our pals all the time? So that's February 13th. So again, this time, but a friendly suggestion. Why don't you tell a friend that you appreciate them? Hayley, I appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate you too.
Oh, thank you so much. So,
getting into the 19th century, there has recently been quite a lot of discussion about books like Jane Austen.
Yes.
And particularly because of the Guardian article on Austen, which I know you will have seen.
I got sent it by like 5 different people. Emails on Twitter, people were tagging me. I was left, right and centre. People wanted me to know about it.
Yes. It's been quite a big thing on social media since then. Quite a few videos have been put out about Austen. And I think one of the things that you very often hear as a critique of Austen is that it is all just romance. Everybody in there just wants to get married. And that, I think, is one of the big factors in what women want in the 19th century, or at least the way that people see what women want in the 19th century. Because, of course, marriage actually really was really important to them.
Yes, I mean, well, to be fair, if you're any class of woman, it does rather dictate your life, because the person you marry has legally has all of your belongings, has your income. Before we get into like the late 19th century, has the right to your children. It's sometimes seen as quite a flippant thing, particularly with Austen, but what I think really needs to be, hammered home is it's really an incredibly crucial decision.
Yeah. I think there are quite a few novels that come out throughout the 19th century where that either becomes a crucial decision that leads to the downfall of one of the heroines, or it's such a crucial decision that it just really dominates their narrative and their emotions throughout the narrative. Now, some of the books that you've been dealing with have that precise issue.
Yes, so definitely not a low stakes decision. Really, really life-changing. I think the best way to think of it now is that it almost functions like a career. It's something that you, it's actually reflected in a lot of the novels and instructional texts and periodicals that you study as well of the time. And a lot of it is, it kind of gives you the life cycle of it almost, because you have the preparation, the courting, and then beyond that, how to be a good wife, how to raise good children, and how to begin the cycle all over again. Okay, so I don't know if you ever watched the Lizzie Bennet Diaries.
No.
Okay, that was based off of Pride and Prejudice. Was a bit of a hit, I think, the year that I first went to university, so I want to say 2012 time. And there's a really funny bit where it's scripted that it's like a game show, and they're trying to guess how many accomplishments Mr. Darcy has on the list. So yeah, it's done in sort of a quiz-like manner. What I find particularly interesting is when you actually read back Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy's not that person. I'm not shading the Lizzie Bennet Diaries; they are fantastic, but it's Caroline Bingley. So they're discussing all the accomplishments a woman should have, and you know, when Mr. Darcy's just like, she should just be great. Austen just goes, his faithful companion says that she needs to have, in order to be called accomplished, she needs to have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, the modern languages, plural, whatever that means. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air, in her manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will only be but half deserved. And the entire rest of the half of that list, vague, Caroline, what does that mean? What does that, I don't understand. And Mr. Darcy just goes, yeah, all of that she has to possess, and to all she must add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading. So, yeah, it goes from Lizzie being like, oh, you know, half a dozen women? I'm surprised you know one person who's like that, which I very much relate to. But I also think it's funny that Mr. Darcy's just like, sure, all of that, but she just has to be well read, which I also think was just, it's just really interesting that that's the thing that he sort of pinpoints on.
Yeah, that's the focus.
Yeah.
That is interesting. I mean, I know that because you look at the novel's manners, you've looked at much earlier examples of advice for women than I've looked at. I mean, I look at kind of mostly mid-century Victorian stuff, and especially periodicals. So things like people might know Mrs. Beeton's handbook, and maybe most famously her How to Run a Household on £200, and this kind of idea of you could read something that would give you advice on how to be the perfect woman, whether that's as a wife or as somebody who is looking to be married. And it's very much about caring, but also quite specific and often quite difficult things potentially, where you make everybody else's life around you easier.
I'm so sorry. I'm grinning because I just remembered there's this bit in the 2005 version of Pride and Prejudice where they're all sat around really awkwardly around the dinner table, and Mr. Collins, it's really, really famous in Meanwhile, they're going, what excellent boiled potatoes. And then he's like, yes, you know, it's so awkward. It's so awkward. And then he's like, around, it's just like, which of my fair cousins, you know, has done this? It's just like, which one of you do I want to bring to wife? And like Mrs. Bennet is like, we have a maid. And a cook, and they do that, which I also like think is funny, almost sort of siphoning him off, just like, this is not an accomplishment that we have, you know, because like my daughters are a gentleman's daughters as well, so there's like lots of different layers, again, like when you're just like, what women want, variety, their accomplishments, variety.
Yeah, I wonder whether that is partly about, as a man, not understanding domesticity in the same way that, or domestic tasks in the same way that the women would.
Or did he really know? Because as we know in the text, he quotes James Fordyce a lot, and James Fordyce has a lot of opinions about how a woman should behave. I mean,
that's a good point.
Most of this seem to be constant synonyms of virtuous and modest. He often gives you like a lot of paradoxes of like, if a man is giving you unwanted attention, you should be polite but firm. So you should be friendly, but you shouldn't harshly rebuff them. And I'm like, I feel like that also kind of works in 21st century problems of, so if someone gave you that as a solution to the problem of a man giving you unwanted advances, it's just like, what does that actually mean? That's not going to work. I was like, James, I don't think you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think later on that does become addressed more easily in periodicals, actually, again, because if we look at Isabella Beeton and Samuel Beeton's periodical, which was the Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine, they had the conversation section where women would write in every month with their problems and ask for advice. And actually quite a few of those are things like, this is the situation with this young man. How do I respond to that? What's the polite thing to do in this situation? And so, yes, I think clearly there was not enough advice in those former texts.
I feel like maybe Lydia Bennet would have responded to that better if someone had given her a little magazine article, because as we know from Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Collins decides after dinner he's going to read from the sermons. That's their evening entertainment. He gets 3 pages in, and Lydia's like, let's do something else. So yeah, maybe if we'd just been able to slip Lydia Bennet a little magazine article, that might have been a little more prosperous for her.
Yeah, I think Lydia Bennet actually, she is a good example of why marriage and understanding the kind of formalities and the proper conduct around marriage was so important, because of course it nearly ends disastrously for Lydia.
It does, and it's a bit difficult because she never really... There's been like a lot of talk on this recently, because, you know, a lot of readers tend to find her frustrating because she never really seems to learn her lesson. You know, she technically sort of gets away with it, but she doesn't, because she's 15 and she's married to Wickham, and I can't see that as a win in anybody's book, let's be honest.
Severe punishment.
I mean, imagine it like 10 years down the line, just a year down the line, just no. And given the fact, like, the end of Pride and Prejudice, actually, I don't know if you know this, like, one of the final lines of it is essentially Lizzie siphoning cash off of, like, Pemberley that she's given to run the household so she can send it to Lydia. Darcy doesn't know.
Yeah, actually, I think that's really telling in itself in Pride and Prejudice. Who has the power when Lydia gets into trouble? Nobody's really able to help her. Lizzie kind of has that moment where she's panicking when she first hears the news, and ultimately it is a man and money who is able to rescue her, if we consider that a rescue, from the situation.
It's the closest we were going to get to a rescue.
Yes. Yeah. There was no way back. And that in itself, actually, is the importance of it. Once she made that mistake, the only way out of that was to get married.
It's also really weird because, if I'm remembering correctly, Mr. Bennet only actually looks for Lydia for like 3 weeks, and then he goes back home. It's like, I'd maybe search for your 15-year-old. Maybe I think the thing is that he runs out of money, but also you kind of just get the feeling like he's just a little bit over the drama of it all and wants to kind of like retreat to his study again, because that's kind of where he's been for the last, let's see, as many years as the girls have been born, really, so probably like the last 15 years of his life. So it's only sort of Darcy, basically almost in order to win Lizzie's hand, that he even bothers to stick it out as long as that. Well, I guess it's also self-serving, because like he can't marry Lizzie if Lydia isn't married.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
I thought of it.
It wouldn't... okay, but here's the thing I always think about, and this kind of like gets touched on in like Death Comes to Pemberley, which is a fun little thing with a nice little BBC series to go along with it. But in that, like, it's almost like a decade in the future, and it's like a murder mystery. But it did make me think. I was just like both Darcy and Lizzie from different angles now have Wickham as a brother-in-law.
Yeah.
And also that means that Georgiana, Darcy's sister, who Wickham first went after when she was 15, is also now related by marriage to Wickham. So
very uncomfortable.
Yeah, the levels of trappings are actually a little bit, uncomfortable.
Maybe quite distantly related, but the situation with Lydia and how she is sort of nearly ruined by her fleeing with Wickham. Could we compare that maybe to Tess in Tess and the D'Urbervilles and what happens to her? Because there's nobody there to save her when she is ruined, and obviously that is in a different way. She doesn't intentionally.
Yeah, and she has that argument with her mum about the fact that there was no one there to explain to her the rules. And like Mrs. Bennet is actually thrilled that Lydia's married. Like there's never any conversation that what she's like, you know, she's kind of on the sofa having her nerves while Lydia's away. But the second that she finds out that Lydia's married, sort of...
It's fine, it's fixed.
Exactly. Her youngest married at 15 as well. Like, there's no... You know, it never really comes to rest, whereas I think Tess, because it's written a little bit later and it's written in a very different context, it gives them the opportunity for Tess to be like, you did not explain the basics to me. And I think that's another one of the reasons why the instructionals are so important. So you know that in my research on like the novel of manners, I also look at Anna Letitia Barbauld.
Yeah.
Yes. So for the uninitiated, Anna Letitia Barbauld is a really, really cool lady. So she wrote poetry. She wrote various essays as well. Like a very, very well-educated woman for the period. And as she sort of grew older, she also became an editor, and she was given the British Novelists, which was a pretty big deal because that's whenever publications like that kind of come out with like the British Novelist, such a definitive title.
Yeah.
They're trying to sell that, and they're trying to sell that for years on end. And one of the things that I loved in her, she has this 50-page essay that she prefaces the entire collection with. And she essentially explains that novels are really great. They're not the trash that everyone thinks that they are. They're actually really great, and they actually have this really important purpose because it's a way for young people, and especially young girls, to experience problems secondhand, to experience, you know, sort of the harassment that we see in like Frances Burney's book Evelina, well actually most of her books to be honest, of young women and men getting into carriages without their permission or getting into theatre boxes and saying some kind of inappropriate things and not letting go of their hands, which is very uncomfortable. And I always thought, you have a second hand, just whack it around. Yeah, so she says, you know, by having novels where you can see all the things that go wrong, they can have these almost like passionate experiences, but see the problems, and they can like learn the worth of the people they really should be going after.
It's actually interestingly connected to that. Maureen Perkins wrote an article about the women's periodicals, like the Englishwoman's Domestic magazine, and she was talking about fiction, the fiction that was in there, which is sometimes serialized, sometimes it was just short stories. And she's basically saying the same thing, that it's through those stories that women could learn what to do in certain situations. They would learn about relationships, about the kind of things that might go wrong, the kind of things that maybe they should be looking out for when they're choosing partners and things like that. I think the way that she puts it is the princess arrives, but the prince doesn't do his job. And that definitely is something that's very visible in a lot of these stories where men do silly things that get women into a lot of trouble.
Complicated situations.
Very much so, yeah. In fact, I think probably my favourite one, because it is related to Dream, and I can't remember the title of it right now, but perhaps we could put that up somewhere. And essentially it is about a woman who falls in love with this young man, and he's intending to propose to her, but he has to go away for some reason, and he doesn't propose to her before he goes. Yeah. He's planning to do that when he gets back. So he takes a while. He's a bit waylaid on this journey.
As you always are in such stories.
Yes, and while he's away, her parents decide that she needs to get married, so they just tell her to marry this other man who she has absolutely no feelings for, but essentially, as you said earlier, you didn't really have any legal rights. You're owned by your father and then by your husband, and so she's pressured into it. And she manages to communicate with her initial love through dream. She visits him in dream, and she tells him that how terribly he has affected her life by not proposing to her when he should have. And he's very freaked out by it. And it
Same.
kind of has a happy ending, because I believe that the man that she married dies, although I can't remember how he dies.
And she
decides that she does not want to be married again. She's had enough of that, and so they don't kind of reconnect afterwards. And that was her kind of, not revenge, but her letting him know that he wronged her because of the social norms of the day that he didn't understand, even though they were so important to her.
And she redeemed herself, but she was like, I refuse to redeem you. You have to redeem yourself.
Absolutely.
Yeah, which I like that. I think that's quite powerful. I think that there's an interesting aspect when it comes to property and having to obey. So I actually touch on this in my thesis, of having to tread that line of basically being obedient enough that, you know, you don't have to do anything rash, or the people who are either your parents or your guardians don't do anything rash, but have a strong enough sense of purpose, or have enough money or social leverage to hold on to that. So it's this, even in the best case scenario, it seems to be this sort of tightrope walk. You know, you don't necessarily have to be obedient 100% of the time. I mean, so few of Austen's heroines, for example, are. But there is like a trade-off. There's a compromise. There's like a if not explicit, at least an implicit social compromise. There's lines that people are colouring inside of.
Yeah, and that absolutely happens in that one, because of course the reason that she's able to decide to be independent is because her husband's died, and now she owns his. She is inherited from him, so she can make that choice now. She's not dependent solely on her parents. Although that doesn't always work out very well for even the wealthy heroines. I think probably my favourite example of that would be No Name by Wilkie Collins, which I think we've discussed a bit before. So in No Name, the family is quite wealthy at the beginning, and the woman is going to marry the man that she loves, even though he's not very wealthy, and he doesn't seem to have very good career prospects. Everything's going a bit wrong for him. But because because she has money and she's going to have a good inheritance, it's okay. They can get married and they can live on her inheritance, and their parents agree for them to be married, and then her parents die. And because girls don't automatically inherit, her and her sister are just left with nothing, and everything goes to, I think it's her father's brother, who just has no interest in helping them, and so they just have to work it out themselves. And that simultaneously just completely overturns their life, but it also destroys that marriage. That now can't happen. And actually what happens after that, and her attempt to reclaim her name and her inheritance, is really interesting. Probably one of my favourite Wilkie Collins books, actually.
I also see like some Sense and Sensibility vibes in there as well, because, you know, that story basically begins with, if you don't know it, it's got three sisters and a mother in it. The two main sisters are Eleanor and Marianne, and basically their father dies, and their brother from a previous marriage, he comes in, he inherits everything, and, you know, it's not exactly codified, but it's his father expressly says that he wants him to look after Eleanor and Marianne and his wife, and also there's Margaret, but like most of the time she's hiding under tables or hiding in trees. I need someone to write from Margaret's perspective.
That would be brilliant.
I'd love to know. And his wife kind of batters him down a bit. So it goes from giving them like actual money, and they're just like, oh, but they're going to move to this small cottage. They won't know what to do with this huge amount of money. So let's just not give them the burden of money.
Because who would want that?
God, what a disaster, the burden of money. Sure. And she just like, she beats him down and like again and again and again. And in the end, they're essentially left with linens. Yes, there's actually an amazing episode that the thing about Austen does on linens, where they essentially explain what a quintessential part of the household it is. So it does have, from their material culture perspective, it does have a lot of sense of the household, sense of the home, sense of the family. They are inherited items. But the other thing that you have there is, if they are the only thing you are given and you are not given any money to deal with any of the basics, what use of it? It's like being given like a set of silver teaspoons, but you don't have basic cutlery. Yeah. Another quick addition there.
Yeah, I think that it definitely is similar. Interestingly, quite far apart from each other. And I think that is another thing that's interesting about the 19th century when we're talking about it with different areas of research, because there are still so many crossovers with women and how they're treated and the things that they want and need, even though we are talking about really, many decades apart sometimes.
So from your story and my story, basically women want nice brothers and nice uncles who don't steal their money from them. That's what they want. It's not all romantic. Sometimes it's just, don't cheat us of an inheritance.
Yeah. And that kind of safety is what's so important, really, about marriage, which then explains why it becomes so important. And I think probably the most famous example of that has to be the I'm 27, really no money, no prospects, and I'm scared.
I'm already a burden to my parents. Haven't we all been there, friends? Yes.
Because it was scary, genuinely scary to be in that situation. I think that's something that people maybe don't appreciate, especially with that situation when it's easy to criticize her decision that, why would you do that? Why would you marry somebody that you don't love when it's just about money? But, she really is genuinely afraid for her future, because if you don't have an income, if you don't have the security of a home, what do you do? What happens to you?
Sudden thought, what periodicals was Charlotte Lucas reading? Because that woman is savvy. She's a savvy lady.
Yeah.
So like when she does marry Mr. Collins, she barters. She's like, I'm having my own parlour because I need lady alone time, because I'm such a lady. And I think because, Mr. Collins has read a lot of these conduct books of the time, he thinks that there's this quite wide distinction, and he almost sees like womanhood and femininity as something that he can kind of know and revere, but also I feel like Charlotte uses that in a really specific way to basically give her as little time with her husband as possible. Again, very, very savvy.
She is, definitely. Yeah. Possibly one of my cleverer characters.
Yeah, but like vastly underrated. I also think it's a little bit uncomfortable, but also kind of interesting, because it's mostly just like, why would you sort of marry Mr. Collins, blah, blah, blah. But there's not a lot of time taken at the fact of she's going to live in Longbourn. Like the place that Lizzie grew up Charlotte is going to own it, essentially, by marriage, but it's going to be hers one day.
Yeah, that kind of trade-off, like you said, it can never be just fully, she can own that house, she can become free, there's always that little bit of trade-off that's related to marriage.
I always wonder whether Charlotte would maybe like, because Mr. Collins is like obsessed with Lady Catherine de Bourgh. I wonder whether at some point in the future Charlotte was like, darling, Mr. Bennet is dead, but we can't possibly part from Lady Catherine, so just let Lizzie and the girls stay there, because I mean Jane and Lizzie do get married, but I do wonder if like an alternative line that might have worked.
Yeah.
And I also wonder whether maybe just like, I feel like maybe Mary could just hang out in Longbourn. I'm not sure she really cares about hanging out with Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy. I think just let Mary hang out at Longbourn, practice her piano, read some stuff. I mean, technically Mary is the most accomplished of all the sisters, but also potentially not. Her piano playing is a bit dire. She tries really hard. Oh, poor Mary.
Yeah, and actually, I guess that set of accomplishments, which you mentioning earlier, that is also part of what women want, but again, very much because of
air quotes.
Yes, very much because of the expectations that you have to have that bargaining chip. What do you have to give to catch a husband, essentially? Even when I think it's fair to say that now some of those skills that women did have are seen as frivolous and almost kind of silly, or not worth as much because they weren't making money, because they weren't careers. But actually, if you look at, for example, in the Englishwoman's Domestic magazine, where there were suggestions of things that you could do around the house, things that you could make, things that you could cook, they're actually really difficult, really skilled. Lots of sewing, embroidery, sometimes dressmaking. They actually had kind of the sheets that you could cut out. That was a big part of the Englishwoman's Domestic magazine, so you'd actually make your own.
Yeah, so for those of you who are not on sort of crafty YouTube, if you watch Bernadette Banner or Rachel Maxey, they often get either like costume ones or vintage ones, and they fully like have to spread all over the floor with all of their pins and whatnot. And every time I look at it, I just think, that's like algebra made tangible, and I'm uncomfortable.
Yeah.
What a cool skill to have, but just something that hasn't really, I guess, been passed on after sort of pre-made clothing. Yeah.
Understandably in some ways, I think.
Yes. Yes, because it's quite time-saving not to have to make everything yourself.
Yeah.
But also kind of sucks because then nothing you own actually fits you.
Good point. That would have been a bonus of having that skill, definitely. Yeah, but I think undervaluing the kind of skills that women did have, even when they were just expected to be married, and I say that with air quotes as well, because that just carries, as we were just saying, a lot of weight for them. There's a lot of expectation of input into being marriageable and finding the right husband and being a good wife. Well, they're saying that not everybody agreed with the kind of existing guides to how to be a good woman, how to be a good wife. And maybe, again, some people might be familiar with Mary Wollstonecraft and her vindication of the rights of women, where she actually sort of directly refers to actually a couple of the guides that I think you've looked at.
Yes, because she not only slaps back at James Fordyce, she also is not a huge fan of Dr. Gregory. He wrote letters to his daughters, which, again, they're like different variations of the same basic tenets, basically.
Yeah. I think she suggests that she wouldn't allow girls to read Fordyce's books because he would take out every spark of their nature, this idea that it would make everybody this kind of very artificial, boring, homogenous thing. And I believe she also kind of suggests that he doesn't really understand love or emotion in vindication of the rights of women.
And And I support that, Mary. I don't think that, I don't think it was a great thing that, I mean, it's one of those things of it being like, yeah, I mean, Fordyce's sermons were actually incredibly popular. They were sold everywhere, and unless I'm getting this very wrong, I believe Cassandra actually got Austen a copy of Dr. Gregory's letters to his daughters for one of her birthdays. Again, without any context, who knows whether she, like Cassandra, who's often seen as sort of the calmer, more tragic figure because unfortunately she lost her fiancé. He died of yellow fever before they could marry, and then Cassandra never marries. But who knows whether she gave that, like, seriously to Jane of being like, oh, you know, you have to be very prim and proper, or whether she gave it to her to be like, this is funny.
Yes.
Almost as a gag.
Very interesting to know.
I know, all the time. I do wonder.
This will be an interesting read, but maybe not in the way that you expect.
I have questions.
I think maybe one of the things that we could touch on here is what women wanted from a husband and what they didn't want from a husband.
Probably quite, again, varied depending on what you're really looking for. So, like, Charlotte Lucas, we don't get much of an insight into her, but she just really seems to be like, are you a person who, if I tell you, here are my rules, are you going to respect the rules? And it seems like Mr. Collins does respect the rules. It's not like that novel, Mrs. Matthews. I can't remember the author's name right now. Put it up here. But in that, she's actually quite a mature lady. I believe she's in, I want to say her 50s. Again, if not, correction on screen now. Or edited into audio. I believe that she's in her 50s, like her father is really cracking on. He's a little bit worried, that she's going to suffer after his death, even though she deals with all the household management, she can look after herself. And so she's a bit like, she begrudgingly and kind of almost patronisingly is just like, yes, Dad. Yeah, fine, I'll marry somebody. So she decides to marry her dad's friend on the agreement that she will be given her own space and her own money, which she agrees to wholeheartedly. And then her dad dies and he takes away her money. She can no longer run the household accounts, and he takes away her private space. And I know. Yeah. I was like, can we get that in writing? Do we need to get that notified by a lawyer? I'm not sure how that would have worked at that time period. It's not like you can have like an addendum to a marriage license of like, here are the rules. Particularly something that's like £500 a year or something, and like, what if your income dropped below? Just like, we're no longer married because you only gave me £498 this year. So, as with all novels of manners, he deals with very low, very vulgar people. She has to sort of grin and bear it while holding on to her principles. He eventually dies, feeling really bad about it, and all of that property and all that money reverts to her anyway. So she's basically where she was at the beginning of the novel, and the whole point of it is her one mistake is basically conceding to her father that she didn't know best.
Yeah.
And entering into that contract.
Yeah, and of course, with divorce being so difficult and so expensive, even
and stigmatized as well,
progressed, yeah. Once you got married, you were quite stuck for most people.
Okay. There's this wild thing. There's this wild thing about Sylvia's lovers. I'm trying to think who the theorist was. I can't remember who it is. But they had this really cool idea about Sylvia's lovers. So, Sylvia's lovers, if you've never heard of it, an underrated classic by Elizabeth Gaskell.
Just expect to be heartbroken.
It's tragic, guys. It's real tragic. So just like steel yourself. Like there's a lot happens. I think one of the reasons it hasn't really been picked up as much is because it's quite a complex classic. There's like a lot of themes. So like, okay, what have I got? There's whaling. There's whaling is in trying to catch a whale, not just random crying, just so everyone's clear. Trying to catch whales, aka whaling. There's press gang. That's when basically the Navy in particular is just like, we need more fighting men, and the sovereign has said it's totally okay if we essentially kidnap people and then they can fight for us. So there's press ganging. There's trials. There's execution. There's smuggling.
Very dramatic.
It's so dramatic. There's lost lovers. There's false marriages. There's mental breakdowns. There's vicious rumours. It's everything you could ever want in a book, is what I'm saying. But one really cool point that, again, I cannot remember the theorist's name, and I do apologise, that she says is, at the time Gaskell was writing it, so Gaskell's writing it between the years of 1861 and 1863, it's coming out in periodical form, first and foremost, and then 1863 is published, and it's so popular, it has a second edition come out in the same year. So anyone who says it's not great, just know contemporaries thought it was great. And in it basically says that because the laws around divorce were sort of moving along in the 1860s, although Sylvia's Love is set in the 1790s, there becomes this split. So, spoiler alert if you want to read it, but I suggest still reading it even if I ruin it for you. Essentially, Sylvia is in love with a man called Charlie Kinbraid, and he's incredibly dashing and a bit cheeky. He's a bit cheeky. He's a bit of a lad about town. But he's like a famous whaler, and she really fancies him because he comes back from whaling, and a press gang tries to sort of trap the ship, and he comes away wounded, and another man has died. And he's this very heroic figure. He even struggles to a grave site to send off that man who died, and Sylvia's like, wow, check him out. And then, okay, if there are any Philip stans in the chat, just brace yourself. Philip is slimy. I don't like him. Okay. Philip is Sylvia's cousin, and he is crushing on her. He's crushing on her quite bad. But essentially, he is trying to pursue Sylvia. Kinraid is pursuing Sylvia. Kinraid obviously makes it because Sylvia actually likes him. Sylvia rebuffs Philip at every turn. One day, Philip is walking along the dunes and he sees Kinraid being kidnapped, and Kinraid explicitly tells Philip, I mean, the press gangers don't go for Philip. They take one look at him and think, no, this is not going to be of any help in a war situation. Sylvia. Oh God. So they steal Kinraid. Kinraid explicitly tells Philip, tell Sylvia to wait for me. I will wait for her. I'm coming back. And Philip sees this and he's like, a dilemma. A dilemma has presented itself to me. And then he says nothing. Nothing. Silence. And he just lets Sylvia basically sit around and think, he's gone, what's happened? I don't know. Various tragedies before her family, which puts her in a very financially precarious situation. Philip proposes and she thinks, well, he's been so supportive during these, difficult financial straits and the breakdown in her mother's health, and, he is her cousin, and I think she sees it more of an agreement, if that makes sense, than he really does, because he is still like head over heels in love with her. Or is he? Because there's this whole thing of like, is it just really creepy, wild obsession on his part? Which kind of, we took, like, Philip almost thinks at the end of the novel, he's just like, I kind of idolized you like a god, and maybe if I'd spent more time actually thinking about the tenets of religion, maybe I wouldn't have done that. So she marries Philip. They have a daughter together as well, which I was shocked at when I first read. I thought, oh, it's going to be like, it's usually the tragic romance of someone's married, but then I turned the chapter and she got a baby. I was like, oh, this changes things. We've crossed the point of no return in Victorian literature.
Yeah.
You haven't just married somebody a baby. So Kinraid comes back and he's like, what have you done? And Sylvia, understandably, is really, really angry. She tells Philip exactly what she thinks of him. She's just like, look, okay, right. She has to go back into the shop. She has a small breakdown. And she says, okay, Kinraid, I am married. I cannot be with you. I cannot run away with you. And he's like, but your vows aren't true. Like, your vows to me, outside of the bonds of marriage were actually true. So you shouldn't. She's like, no, I'm married. We'll have one final kiss. And then I can't ever see you again. Goodbye. You're from Earth. Then she turns on to Philip and she says, you are no longer my husband. She's like, no, you lied. Our entire relationship is predicated on a lie that you told. No. And this theorist was basically saying how Sylvia kind of goes through some kind of spiritual act of divorce.
Yeah. Even
though she actually can't divorce. And there was this really interesting point in the 1860s where more divorces were coming about, where you could legally be divorced from somebody and technically remarry, but spiritually divorce didn't exist. Like, you've taken the sacrament, so you remain married. So it's almost like really kind of like working out in real time what that would be like.
Yeah, because some level of entrapment remains in that case.
I've never been so angry because, like, everyone in her circle basically says, this is unfortunate, Sylvia, but you made a vow. You married this man. And I was like, it's predicated on a lie. It doesn't count. They cannot. They just want to keep it going. Philip is head man at the local haberdashery, which is also the centre of a smuggling ring. So it's all, he's the big shot. So I guess we all just have to deal with the fact that he entrapped his emotionally vulnerable, financially unstable younger cousin whose father had just been executed and whose mother was going through a mental breakdown, who couldn't recognise anybody. And we've all just got to be okay with that, apparently, according to the village of Monkshaven.
I'm very much not okay with the ending.
I'm not okay. I'm not okay with that. Not okay with any of that.
No, but it is an excellent example of what we were just talking about, because you do have to be, they did have to be, I should say, very careful about what situations they got themselves into when they got married, because it wasn't something that was easily changed, easy to get out of. Partly because, as you said, not even from a legal perspective, but even if you had the money after divorce was possible, then you also have the potential social stigma of divorce as well.
Yeah, and it really takes me back to, I don't know if there's any of you who did Wuthering Heights at GCSE or A-level, but I do remember one of the key pieces of contention amongst classmates was Cathy's relationship with Heathcliff. And everyone thinking, oh, but Cathy wants Heathcliff, so why does she marry Edgar Linton? I was going to say Hindley, but I was like, that's her brother, that's not the correct name. Why does she marry Edgar Linton? And she's like, when she clearly wants Heathcliff, she should have just thrown caution to the wind and, it's because she cares about being fancy and being part of the Grange and, she wants to get away from, like, the barbarity of, Wuthering Heights and, be fawned upon, because there's that bit where, Cathy and Heathcliff run away and then she gets bitten by that big dog and then is sort of set up in the living room and her wounds are tended and Heathcliff's looking through the window and he's just like, oh, she's been taken, like, they possess her now. And okay, first of all, that seems more like entrapment again.
Yeah.
Like she's wounded, she physically can't really leave. I think she stays there for like a week or something, isn't it? Yeah, while she's healing. But another point there is Heathcliff's gone. I cannot stress how much he wasn't there. There was no forwarding address. You can't text this man. He's gone. He's like, he was transplanted into that situation anyway. If he just wanted to walk out, like, what did you want her to do? Just sit around and wait?
Yeah.
So it makes perfect sense to me that she would marry, because not only, it's not like she can sit around and wait anyway, because Hindley is drinking himself out of house and home and spending a lot of money on his new and fancy wife. So Cathy's actual financial situation and her prospects are just depleting by the day.
Yeah.
And Edgar's okay with marrying her. It makes complete sense to me. So, okay, what women want, she might have wanted Heathcliff, but that wasn't really an option.
Yeah, and that waiting as well, that is another big thing for women, this kind of time limit on when you have to have things done by. And we were both laughing earlier at a tweet that we saw about Miss Havisham, and how she's only supposed to be 37, and yet she's...
I mean, okay, I was thinking about this, and someone needs to draw up a timeline, because I was thinking for Austen, like, the turning point is 27. You know, Charlotte Lucas is 27.
Yeah.
Anne Elliot, when they're like, oh, put her on the shelf.
Yeah.
She's past her sell-by, is 27. And I'm wondering, you know, I was thinking, oh, maybe it gets to leap forward 10 years by Dickens' time. So I was like, no, if you're, like, at the turning point of your expiration date at 27, Miss Havisham is a mess. She's a mess. Like, that's what you become, surely.
Yeah, and again, with the example that I was talking about earlier, with the woman who has to marry because she can't wait for that man to come back to her. A Strange Story is the name of that story, not the Bulwer Lytton one. Although there is some suggestion that the author might have copied that.
Yeah, you've only ever told me about the Bulwer. This is...
Yeah. So this story is called A Strange Story, and there is a snippet of poetry at the beginning of that short story, which is a German poem translated by Bulwer, and actually at the beginning, where the two men are talking to each other, and he's revealing to his friend about this strange dream he had where he was visited by his former lover. They talk a lot about the same kinds of magnetic connections between minds and things like that actually Edward Bulwer Lytton was talking about in his Strange Story. So probably an intentional reference.
I think so. That's really cool. Although I'm begging you, authors of the past, I know you can't change it, and authors of the present and future, I was going to say, don't reuse the names of things, and then I just remembered what our podcast was called. Scratch that. Apart from us, we're the exception.
But yeah, so having to wait in that one, that's what causes the problem. She can't wait. There is no option for that to be the case. As you said, we might see in Wuthering Heights, Cathy doesn't really have the option to wait. She doesn't know what might happen in that time. And yeah, in lots of other pieces of fiction as well, just the necessity of finding that security before you go past your shelf life, as you put it.
I know. I'm just thinking, because, like, Miss Havisham was meant to be like a fine-looking lady as well, and I was like,
yeah, she's very often depicted as much older.
Yeah. I was thinking about that in, like, various, like, actresses or, like, even paintings. She's only 37. Like, again, and she was also meant to be gorgeous, and also, like, she's well within childbearing age as well. There's no reason why she should be on the shelf either. Just Although I will tell you as a quick aside, one time when I set up this English Society at university, and in order to reel in as many customers as possible, I did a bake sale stall outside of the library.
Nice.
Luckily it was summer, because I'm about to tell you something. I decided that we should all dress up as literary characters, and I decided to dress up as Miss Havisham. Now, if you don't quite remember the description, everything's half done, so like half her hair is done and the other half isn't, but also she's only wearing one shoe.
Yes. Were you fully dedicated to
I
Havisham
was
outfit?
dedicated. People were frightened. I saw people tweeting the library being like, am I having some kind of mental breakdown? And I was like, no, it's us, come buy a cake. People did come buy a cake.
I would have gone to that.
Well, I was partially doing like, you can take a picture as long as you buy a cake. But yes, I was very committed. It's very committed. Very committed to the role. I wasn't so committed that I actually went into the charity shop and bought an ex-wedding dress, but I did buy a white dress. It felt a bit far.
That's one step too far.
It's quite expensive. So I just bought a cheap white dress and was like, it's not. I was just like, technically, it's in keeping, because she's been in the wedding dress for a few years, so it's not on trend. So it's old and a bit dilapidated, and that's where I was going with it.
I hope there are still existing pictures of this.
I might have scrubbed them from the internet.
You might have to try to find some. But actually, I think because we've been talking so much about that kind of before marriage point, actually, if you think about the older women, by older I do mean the past 27 age of women.
Women our age, I mean, my God.
I mean, that in itself is an interesting thing, because Miss Havisham's a slightly different example. Of course, she decides to sort of take her revenge on society in the way she was wronged by society as a young woman whose marriage doesn't go to plan, which doesn't necessarily happen in too many other places, at least not as far as I can remember. But we do very often get that kind of aunt figure, or somebody who's trying to advise the young women about their marriages.
There seem to be two aunt figures in like novel of manners, like novel of manners adjacent, at least threads in conversation, and that's either someone who has fallen from grace completely or somebody who's been very successful. And again, there's just no middle ground. In so many of these things, there is no compromise, there is no middle ground, and I think that is part of the stress of all of this, the stress of the preparation, the stress of the quarantine, even the stress of being married. Because, I mean, nowadays you see it in magazines, sort of going back to our What Women Want. You also have like how to keep your man. And I feel like that was still quite, although it's less discussed explicitly in novels, it's sort of picked up more, I feel, in instructionals of, it's mostly men writing about like, do this and I will like you more as a wife, but it's less so particularly amongst sort of women literature, sort of how to sort of, because you're married to that person and you kind of have to keep them on side to a certain extent because they have all of your property, they have all of your...
very difficult.
Life could become incredibly difficult if you're not having at least an amicable time.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. I think maybe this, you can correct me here, maybe it is more of a later second half of the 19th century thing, but when I think of that, the aunt figure, that sort of older female family member, I think in all of the examples I can think of, they are very wrong in their opinions, and there's some kind of pushback from the younger generation.
Are you thinking of Aunt March?
I was thinking about March.
I knew it.
Yeah, because she advises that it's your responsibility to make a good match, and by good she means wealthy, to bring money and to set yourself up for the rest of your life in that way. And actually the mother doesn't agree with her. She does want her children to marry for love, and she actually explicitly says that she would rather see them poor than unhappy for other reasons. Yeah,
I'm thinking about, and Anne Bronte's incredibly long list in the tent of Wildfell Hall because in that in that novel, our heroine does marry for love, but not with much forethought, and that's kind of picked up on by Alcott really as well, because they are poor and it is a struggle. Like, it wasn't like, they rolled the dice, maybe he'd have been poor. No, he was poor. Like, she followed through with that. And for this I am going to actually have to read off a list, because there's so many lists in that book. I read it and I noted them all down of reasons not to marry. So this is another, going back to your idea of what women want and what they don't want. We're moving that into why you should get married and maybe why you shouldn't get married. So in the list here, we have reasons that you shouldn't get married are for lots of money, for a good position in society, because your mother wants you to, because your brother is whinging about you hanging around the house all the time, all of your friends think your potential husband is gorgeous, to get back at a relative's really annoying self-righteous advice. You have an all-consuming passion, which I do feel like might have been a dig. To make someone who's really malicious jealous. And here we get into more serious form. If he's a worthy man, but you don't actually like him. If you really like him, but he's not worthy of you. Also, if he has a horrible mother, which I could see, because can you imagine just constantly being in that situation? I truly do not want to know.
Terrible family dinners.
No, forever. That one, more than your husband dying, because that happens a lot, as we've said, particularly, in these novels, if they're not worthy, you really would be sitting there just thinking, one day. And then the last, more convoluted reason, which is kind of the entire plot of the Tent of Wildfell Hall, when our heroine is deciding whether to remarry. One reason why you shouldn't get married is if you like him now and he's worthy, but there's the possibility, even if you can't possibly foresee it in the present moment, that at some point in the future you might have a really important disagreement. Don't know what psychic you're going to.
Yeah, that's a complicated one.
I was like,
quite a lot of reasons.
So Anne, is the answer never?
Yeah.
Is the answer never?
Possibly it should have been.
Yes.
One of those.
And I think in context, when you kind of realise that the struggles that, her heroine has been through, with a husband that she liked, but then turned out not to be worthy of her, and to essentially turn into an alcoholic who was cruel and was not a good father figure to her young son. You can see why you might be a little bit hesitant to jump back into the fold.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely some potential for terrible things, really, to happen to you as a result of getting that one decision wrong. And I think, actually, some of the things on that list, again, show that need for balance. There might be some kind of trade-off where, you've got security, but now you're also married to someone you don't actually like. Or, yes, you've married somebody that you genuinely like, but now you're going to have to struggle financially for the rest of your life. And that might not just be a bit of a struggle. It might be a very, very serious, life-threatening, potentially, situation.
I mean, I was just thinking, so many of the writers that I've read were writing to keep their families afloat as well. So I feel like some of it is coming from personal experience. So we know Austen didn't marry, and I mean, the Bronte sisters died so early. I mean, Charlotte married, but everyone died really early. But I'm also thinking about the lesser-known Trollope, Anthony Trollope's mother, and the fact that she wrote books upon books upon books.
Coming back to that to Little Women, which we were talking about earlier as well, Jo is the perfect example of that, because she has a lot of questions herself about how independent she wants to be, and she's not as sure about marriage and her role as a wife as others. And she's also the writer, and she does manage to do that a bit as not necessarily a career. Obviously, we know that eventually her life does go differently to the way she maybe planned initially.
But is it at least put out as like an actual option for her? Or at least she imagines it as an actual option for her.
Yeah.
And it's not like she's sort of immediately sort of beaten down of like, you can't do this.
No.
Like,
yeah, actually, I think her family at least are very supportive of that, of her writing. It's just that it doesn't necessarily fit in to society, and to sort of see that her sisters are experiencing life differently to the way that she is when they start to get married. So she makes for an interesting figure in that. And Little Women actually has been quite prevalent on social media for the same reason on that subject, but not with Jo, with Amy and
the way she dresses Timothy Chalamet down. We love to see it.
Yeah. So actually the quote that's going around, that's not from the actual original text, but it does actually touch on some of the things that are present in the original text.
And I think in some ways like makes explicit to a modern readership what was kind of written between the lines at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So she's kind of explaining to Laurie how marriage for her doesn't mean the same thing as it does to him, because he can just marry for love, and there are all of these other considerations for her, because she doesn't have her own money, and she would not, for example, have legal rights over her children, and there are all of these kind of other considerations, quite dramatic other considerations, before she makes that. And actually in the book as well, there is quite a bit of discussion, slightly awkwardly throughout, about how much more money Laurie and his family have than the Marches, and how that kind of balance works. And there are I can't remember where they exactly go, but they go to some sort of, or at least some of them go to a party, and there's this, they hear this awkward discussion about Laurie and how they might marry into his family to get money.
A little bit Mrs. Bennet, isn't it?
Yeah.
Being like, 5,000 a year. It's like she's signed up to some kind of subscription service.
Yeah.
Hunting them all down.
Yeah. What's the best deal? What's the best bargain?
Yeah. But again, like, that's kind of seen, and I think as like a lot of readers, it's like quite vulgar, quite inappropriate, quite unladylike, but at the same time, very practical. Mrs. Bennet has 5 daughters. The Marches, how many daughters are there? And they're 5, they're 4. I've lost count. There's Meg, there's Beth, there's Amy, and there's Jo. 4.
Yeah.
Okay, there's 4, there's not 5, but you get the train of thought there. There's many a daughter to. Oh, and of course it's also set during a war.
Yeah,
there's a war going on, so men are in short supply.
Yeah,
it's important to lock them down as quickly as possible. So yeah, there's a lot of conflicting lines of want.
Yeah, and need as well. Because those two things very much with marriage are obviously closely tied together.
Hopefully, but sometimes you have to take the need over the want.
Yeah. And actually there is another good example of that in Little Women, because they of course they have their club, the Pickwick Club, because they're such big Dickens fans, and they have their newsletter. I think they actually call it a newspaper, which is basically a periodical. It's like a collection of all of their writing. And in one of those that we actually see, because it's read out by the characters, there is possibly, it might even be the first story in there, a story about a woman who is about to be married to somebody who she really hates because he has more power and more money than the person she actually wanted to marry. And so, yeah, we still see that coming up, even in their fictional kind of newspaper, those stories that present the fears. And there is kind of a almost silly solution to that in their version. The two characters, the woman and the man that she doesn't actually like, are about to be married, and for some reason they are both wearing masks at this wedding, and at the end they take off their masks, and it wasn't the man that she hated, it was actually the man that she wanted to marry. So they are now married, and he just happens to have made his fortune and now has more status and more money than the person she didn't like. So the perfect conclusion. The perfect fairy tale conclusion.
You would not believe the amount of novels I have read where there's a masked ball, and you really have to suspend your disbelief. Because it's a bit like, it is a bit like Shakespeare, isn't it? You know, like when Beatrice and Benedict get into that argument, and Beatrice is riffing a little harder on Benedict than usual, and Benedict thinks she's being serious because, like, it's obviously him, and he thought they were just playing before that point. And I was like, she's playing, she's just at a higher level than you are. But something similar always seems to happen. It always seems to happen in like conduct novels or novels of manners, in like the late 18th century, sort of bleeding into the early 19th. So there is this absolutely wild scene in, I want to say Conduct. No, it's not Conduct is Fate. That one's a little bit more relaxed. It's another conduct book. I read it while I was at Chawton House. I read it it was a blur. I tried to read like 10 books in the space of a week, and that didn't go to plan. They're all 3 volumes each as well, so just bear that in mind.
That's a lot of conduct.
It was too many, and they were like 2 plot points a page, so I was like scrolling down notes because it's, you know, not like the text are widely available. And brace yourself, because this one is actually a little bit of a wild ride. Basically, someone decides to go to this masked party as a white domino, and this lady overhears that, and this lady dislikes our heroine because her lover is now interested in the heroine. So she decides she's going to go as the white domino and seduce the black domino, because she's thinking, if he's really into the heroine, I'll get to be the heroine and we'll get to have a nice, oh my god, I'm about to say very juvenile, 7 minutes of heaven in the closet somewhere. She goes, she overplays her hand, essentially. She's very seductive, she's very sexual, and again, it's the paradox of womanhood again, almost going back to James Fordyce, of the second that she's sexual, this man loses all interest in this woman that he thinks is the heroine, because he's just like, I do not want to do any of that. You have massively degraded yourself. Stay away from me. And then she sort of unmasks herself, and she's just like, I don't understand you at all. Are you braced? You braced?
I'm ready.
Okay. It turns out this all works out anyway, because, you know, when he eventually finds the heroine, he's just like, oh, I'm so glad that wasn't you, because I could not possibly have respected you if you had had anything but the highest form of love and the best intentions, and not wanted to do anything romantic or sexual. Of course not. Luckily, this is all fine, because it turns out they're half brother and sister later on.
Okay. Yeah, that's a twist.
Yeah, so like in the middle of the book, he's just like, you know, I'm aware that like you're married, and so like I will just be this brother figure, and I will protect your honour when your husband is not around. And then I was just like, it's just as well.
It's quite lucky, really.
Yes, yes. I was unprepared for that. As a 21st century reader, I turned the page, I was like, what's happening? What's happening? Basically a sea captain turns up at like the last 5 pages of this novel, and he's just like, my children. I was like, right, sure. It'd been a long day. It was like early spring. I was in a hot little room. You can't have fluids in there. And I was like, I've got to be reading every second of the day on this trip to Chawton House. I can't have a fluid. I must just read. And it felt like a fever dream by the end. I was like, I don't understand what's happening here.
Brilliant.
It was. So yes, what women want. It's
Not
marriage.
that.
Not that. To clarify, not that.
Absolutely
Any
not
of that even. Like any of that. Look, also don't do mask parties. Unless you know someone who's super into a mask party, don't do it. I think that's my closing advice. Don't do it.
So in conclusion on what women wanted in the 19th century is marriage without something absolutely terrible happening.
Yes, correct.
Enough security without having that entrapment in a terrible relationship.
Yeah. And possibly pushing the envelope, not marriage, and just being able to live your life comfortably with enough money, possibly pursue a writing career.
Yeah. Although socially so incredibly hard, so incredibly unlikely.
Ironically, though, it's the women who were able to do that then wrote it in their stories.
Yeah.
So that's our conclusion. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Well, this month. You will see us next month for another episode. Next month we are doing Victorian motherhood in periodicals. So
for Mother's Day.
Yes, so that should be coming out, I believe, on 17th or the 18th of March. So you can join us then. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for watching. I think the only things that we have left to do is thank various people. So first of all, thank you, Hayley, for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Special thanks to India Downton and extra special thanks to Dave Parks, who did our sound technician and our video editing. Bye for now.
Bye.